Hey everybody, and welcome back. So it's been about a week and a half since I last recorded. I've been back to work for a week now. Doing better. Didn't go in today because, well, I hurt a little too much. So I'm actually starting to apply for some new jobs. I actually found a couple that I might be able to do from home and make some better money. Doubt I'll have any luck, but I mean, I enjoy what I do. I've been doing it for 13 and a half years. But I think it's time. My body isn't responding the way it used to. I remember being, well, other than the break, but I remember being able to get back up and do stuff within a couple of days. This is getting ridiculous. Does nothing for your mental health because you try and keep going, but you can't always go. But hey, I'm here, I'm alive, I'm still on my own 2 feet. It's a good day. So I am going to work on sort of Shannara today, or tonight, I should say. It's after 10, almost 10, something like that. I started recording this chapter last week. And it was the first day I was back to work, and I decided, I'll do the recording tonight, and I'll be great, and I'll be wonderful. I got about 10 minutes recorded, and then every 5 seconds I was yawning. I decided to give it a pause, and I didn't get back to it. So we're going to start it over again. Hopefully this time I won't yawn every few moments. Of course, the second you say yawn, you gotta yawn. Oh, this does look better on there. I'm doing working on a new baby blanket. Actually, I'm just putting the pattern together. For a coworker who is due, I believe she's due in May. So, I'm doing, she didn't give me any specifications. So, except for that they know it's a boy, so they want blue and white. So, this is the blue. I think it's pretty. Sorry. I say yawn, and of course now I'm yawning all the time. I got my caffeine. I had Skitter until a minute ago. Now she's wandered off since she just had her medication. Well, she had her medication a little early tonight. And the alarm went off for me to give it to her. Now she immediately got up and wandered away. It's like, I'm not taking it again. And don't worry, I'm not giving it to her again. Once a day is enough. We do our medicine, then treats. You know, they say you can't, cats are hard to train. I give her medicine, she gets her treats. She tells me when it's time to get her medicine. She knows about the time of night. Mainly because she knows she's going to get a treat. So, in the last chapter of the Sword of Shannara, they had made it to the started off where they had just made it to the Black Oaks, which was fantastic. They made it back. They made it in from their being lost in the mist, only to when they skirted the mist marsh to get lost in the mist again, different mist though, and be attacked by the creature that lives in the marsh. So they escaped again with Menion's help. They decided to just continue to get the heck out of that forest without stopping for sleep. And Shay and Flick got separated from Menion, and that's where the chapter left off. So, where we are starting up is when they wake up after. I can't say the morning of, because really it's not. These poor readers are falling apart on me. I'm going to have to get another cheap pair from the dollar store. All right. Chapter 7. When Shay awoke the following day, it was noon. The bright sunlight streamed into his half-opened eyes with burning sharpness as he lay on his back in the tall grass. At first, he could remember nothing of the previous night, except that he and Flick had become separated from Menion in the Black Oaks. Half awake, he raised himself on one elbow, looked about sleepily, and discovered that he was in an open field. Behind him rose the forbidding Black Oaks, and he knew that somehow, after losing Menion, he had managed to find his way through the dread forest before collapsing in exhaustion. Everything was hazy in his mind after their separation. He could not imagine how he had summoned the strength to finish the march. He could not even recall breaking free of the endless forest to find the grass-covered lowlands he now surveyed. The whole experience seemed strangely distant as he rubbed his eyes and sighed contentedly in the warm sunlight and fresh air. For the first time in days, the Anar forests seemed to be within reach. Suddenly, he remembered Flick and looked anxiously about for his brother. A moment later, he spotted the stocky form collapsed in sleep several yards away. Shay climbed slowly to his feet and stretched leisurely, taking time to locate his pack. He bent down and rummaged through the contents until he located the pouch containing the elf stones, reassuring himself that they were still safely within his possession. Then, picking up his pack, he trudged over to his sleeping brother and gently shook him. Flick stirred grudgingly, clearly unhappy that anyone would disturb his slumber. Shay was forced to shake him several times before he at last reluctantly opened his eyes and squinted up sourly. Upon seeing Shay, he raised himself to a sitting position and looked slowly about. "Hey, we made it!" he exclaimed. "But I don't know how. I don't remember anything after losing Menion, except for walking and walking until I thought that my legs would drop off." Shay grinned in agreement and clapped his brother on the back. He felt a measure of gratitude when he thought of all they had been through together. So many hardships and dangers, and still Flick could laugh about it. He felt a sudden, keen sense of love for Flick, a brother who, while not related by blood, was even closer for his deep friendship. "We made it all right," he smiled. "And we'll make it the rest of the way, too, if I can get you off the ground." "The meanness in some people is unbelievable." Flick shook his head in mock disbelief, and then climbed heavily to his feet. He looked questionably over at Shay. "Menion?" "Lost. I don't know where." Flick looked away, sensing his brother's bitter disappointment, but unwilling to admit to himself that they were not better off without the Highland Prince. He instinctively distrusted Menion. Yet the Highlander had saved his life back in the forest, and that was not something Flick would forget easily. He thought about it a minute or so longer, then clapped his brother lightly on the shoulder. "Don't worry about that rogue. He'll turn up, possibly at the wrong time." Shay nodded quietly, and the conversation quickly turned to the task at hand. They agreed that the best plan was to journey northward until they reached the Silver River, which flowed into the Rainbow Lake, and follow it upstream to the Anar. With any luck, Menion would follow the river and catch up to them within a few days. His skill as a woodsman should enable him to escape the Black Oaks, and at some point beyond find their trail and follow it to wherever they were. Shay was reluctant to leave his friend, but was wise enough to realize that any attempt at a search for him in the Black Oaks would only result in their own entanglement. Moreover, the danger they faced if discovered by the searching skull-bearers far outweighed any risks Menion might encounter, even in that forest. There was nothing for them to do but continue on. The pair walked rapidly through the green, quiet lowlands, hoping to reach the Silver River by nightfall. It was nearly mid-afternoon, and they had no way of knowing how far they might be from the river. With the sun to serve as a guide, they felt more confident of their position than they had in the misty confines of the Black Oaks, where they had been forced to depend on their own unreliable sense of direction. They talked freely, brightened by the sunlight that had been absent for so many days, and by an unspoken feeling of gratitude that they were still alive, following the harrowing experiences of the Mist Marsh. As they walked, small animals and high-flying birds scattered their appearance. Once, in the fading light of the afternoon sun, Shay thought he caught sight of the small, hunched-over form of an old man some distance to the east, moving slowly away from them. But in that light and at that distance, he could not be certain and an instant later found that he could see no one after all. Flick had seen nothing, and the incident was forgotten. By dusk, they sighted a long, ribbon-thin stream of water to the north, which they quickly identified as the fabled Silver River, the source of the wondrous Rainbow Lake to the west, and of 1,000 firelight tales of adventure. It was said that there was a legendary king of the Silver River whose wealth and power was beyond description, but whose only concern was in keeping the waters of the great river running free and clean for man and animal alike. He was seldom seen by travelers, the story related, but he was always there to offer aid should any require it, or to deal out punishment for violation of his domain. On sighting the river, Shay and Flick could only tell that it appeared to be very beautiful in the fading light. Sort of faint silver color that the name implied. When they finally reached its edge, the evening had become too dark to permit them to see how clear the waters really were. But upon tasting it, they found it clean enough to drink. They found a small grass-covered clearing on the south bank of the river, beneath the spreading shelter of 2 broad old maple trees that offered an ideal campsite for the night. Even the short journey of the afternoon had tired them, and they preferred not to risk moving about in the dark in this open country. They had just about exhausted their supplies, and after this evening's meal, they would have to hunt for food. This was particularly disheartening, though, when they recalled that the only weapons they had between them for killing game were the short and highly ineffectual hunting knives. Menion carried the only longbow. They ate the last of their supplies in silence without the use of a cooking fire, which might have called attention to their presence. The moon was half full and the night cloudless, so that the thousands of stars in the limitless galaxy shone in dazzling white, lighting up the river and the land beyond in an eerie, deep green brightness. After their meal was completed, Shay turned to his brother. "Have you thought about this trip? About the whole business of running away?" he queried. "I mean, what are we really doing?" "You're a funny one to ask that," exclaimed the other shortly. Shay smiled and nodded. "I suppose I am, but I have to justify it all to myself, and that's not an easy task. I can understand most of what Al-Anon told us, but the danger to the heirs of the sword. But what good will it do for us to hide out in the Anar? This creature Brona must be after something besides the sword of Shannara to go to all this trouble to search for the heirs of the elven house. What is it that he wants? What could it be?" Flick shrugged and tossed a pebble into the swift current of the lapping river, his own mind muddled, unable to offer any sensible answer. "Maybe he just wants to take over," he suggested vaguely. doesn't want anyone who gets a little power sooner or later? No doubt, agreed Shay uncertainly, thinking that this special form of greed had brought to the races to where they were today, following the long, bitter wars that had nearly destroyed all life. But it had been years since the last war, and the appearance of separate and disassociated communities seemed to have provided a partial answer to the long quest for peace. He turned back to a watchful Flick. What are we going to do once we get where we're going? Al-Anon will tell us, his brother answered hesitantly. Al-Anon can't tell us what to do forever, replied Shay quietly. Besides, I'm not still convinced that he has told us the truth about himself. Flick nodded in his agreement, thinking back to that first chilling encounter with the dark giant who tossed him about like a rag doll. His behavior had always struck Flick as that of a man who was used to having his way and having it when and how he chose. He shivered involuntarily, recalling his first near discovery by the shadowy skull-bearer, and found himself confronted with the fact that it was Al-Anon who had saved him. I'm not sure I want to know the truth of any of this. I'm not sure I would understand, Flick muttered softly. Shay was startled by the comment and turned back to the moonlit waters of the river. We may be only little people to Al-Anon, he acknowledged, but from now on, I don't move without a reason. Maybe so, his brother's voice drifted up to him, but maybe. His voice trailed off ominously into the quiet sounds of the night and the river, and Shay chose not to pursue the matter. Both lay back and were quickly asleep, their tired thoughts flowing sluggishly into the bright, colorful dreams of the momentary world of sleep. In that secure, drifting dimension of fantasy, their weary minds could relax, releasing the hidden fears of tomorrow to emerge in whatever form they wished, and there, in the most distant sanctuary for the human soul, be faced privately and overcome. But even with the reassuring sounds of life all about them and the peaceful rushing of the gleaming silver river to soothe their cares, an inescapable, gnawing specter of apprehension wormed its stealthy way into their dream world, and there, in full view of the mind's eye, it perched and waited, smiling dully, hatefully, knowing well the limits of their endurance. Both sleepers tossed fitfully, unable to shake the presence of this frightening apparition entrenched deep within them, more thought than form. Perhaps it was that same shadow of warning, radiating its special scent of fear, that locked simultaneously in the restless minds of the Veilmen and caused both to waken in the same startled instant, the sleep gone from their eyes, and the air was filled with stark, chilling madness that gripped them tightly and began to squeeze. They recognized it instantly, and panic shone dully in their eyes as they sat motionless, listening to the soundless night. Moments passed, and nothing happened. Still, they remained immobile, their senses straining for the sounds they knew must come. Then they heard the dreaded flapping of the great wings, and together looked to the opening river to see the hulking, silent form of the skull-bearer swooping almost gracefully from out of the lowlands across the river to the north and settle into a long glide, bearing directly towards their place of concealment. The Valemen were frozen with terror, unable even to think, let alone move, as they watched the creature begin to close the distance between them. It did not matter that it had not yet seen them, perhaps did not even know where they were. It would know in the next few seconds. For the brothers, there was no time to run, no place to hide, no chance to escape. Shay felt the dryness of his mouth, and somewhere within his scattered thoughts remembered the elf stones. But his mind had gone numb. He sat paralyzed with his brother and waited for the end. Miraculously, it did not come. Just when it seemed that the servant of the Warlock Lord must surely find them, a flash of light from the other bank caught its attention. Swiftly, it winged away towards the light. And then there was another, a bit further down, and then another. Or was it mistaken? It flew swiftly now, searching eagerly, its cunning mind telling it that the search was at an end, the long hunt over at last. Yet it could not find the source of the light. Suddenly, the light flashed again, only to disappear in the swiftness of a blinking eye. The maddened creature swooped towards it, knowing it was deeper in the blackness across the river, lost somewhere in the thousands of small gullies and dales of the lowlands. The mysterious light flashed again, and then again, each time moving further inland, taunting, daring the angered beast to follow. Yet on the other bank, the petrified figures of the two Valemen remained concealed in the darkness as their frightened eyes, watching the flying shadow move ever more swiftly away from them until it could no longer be seen. They remained immobile after the departure of the skull-bearer. Once again they had come close to death and managed to elude its fatal touch. They sat quietly and listened as the mingled sound of insect and animal returned to the night. Minutes passed, and they began to breathe more easily, their stiff poses relaxing into more comfortable slumps as they looked at each other in amazed relief, knowing the creature had gone, but unable to comprehend how it had happened. Then, before they had any chance at all to speak of the matter, the mysterious light that had flashed from across the river reappeared suddenly on a rise several hundred yards in back of them, disappeared for an instant, and then flashed again, closer than before. Shay and Flick watched in wonderment as it moved towards them, weaving slightly. Moments later, the figure of an old man stood before them, bent with age and clothed in woodsman's garb. His hair silver in the starlight, his face framed by a long white beard, neatly trimmed and combed. The strange light in his hand appeared fiercely bright at this close distance, and there was no hint of a flame in its center. Suddenly it disappeared, and in its place was a cylindrical object gripped in the old man's gnarled hand. He looked at them and smiled a greeting. Shay looked quietly at his ancient face, sensing that the strange man deserved his respect. "The light," Shay spoke finally. "How?" "A toy of people long since dead and gone." The voice rolled out in a steady whisper that drifted on the cool air. "Gone like the evil creature out there." The words trailed off, and he pointed in the direction of the departed skull-bearer with a thin, wrinkled arm that seemed to hang in the night like some brittle stick of dead wood. Shay looked doubtfully at him, unsure of what should be done next. "We are traveling eastward," Flick volunteered abruptly. "To the Anar." The gentle voice cut him short, the elderly head nodding in understanding, the wrinkled eyes sharp in the soft moonlight as they looked from one brother to the other. Suddenly he moved past them to the edge of the swift river, then turned back to them and motioned for them to sit. Shay and Flick did so without hesitation, unable to doubt the old man's intentions. As they sat, they felt a great weariness steal over their bodies, their eyes suddenly unable to remain open. "Sleep, young travelers, that your journey may be shortened." The voice became stronger in their minds, more commanding. They could not resist the feeling of weariness, so pleasant and welcome, and they stretched out on the soft, grassy bank in obedience. The figure before them began to change slowly into something new, and through vague, blurred eyes and half-closed eyes, it appeared that the old man was growing younger, and his clothes were not the same. Shay began to mutter slightly, trying to stay awake, to understand. But a moment later, both Veilmen were asleep. As they slept, they drifted cloud-like through the forgotten days of sunlight and happiness in the peaceful woodland home that they had left so many days ago. Once again, they roamed the friendly confines of the Doolin forest and swam in the cool waters of the mighty Rappahalladin River. The fears and cares of a lifetime swept away in an instant. They moved through the wooded hills and vales of the countryside with freedom unlike anything that they had ever experienced. In their sleep, they touched, as if for the first time, each plant and animal, bird and insect, with new understanding of its importance as a living thing, however small and insignificant. They floated and drifted like the wind, able to smell the freshness of the land, able to see the beauty of the life nature had placed there. Everything was a kaleidoscope of color and smell, with only gentle sounds reaching their tired minds, sounds of the open air and the quiet countryside. Forgotten were the long, hard days of travel through the mist-covered lowlands of Cleet, the sunless days where life was a lost soul, one wandering hopelessly in a dying land. Forgotten was the darkness of the black oaks, the madness of the endless giant trees, hiding them from sun and sky. Gone was the memory of the mist wraith and the pursuing skull-bearer, constant, relentless in its search. The young Valeman moved in a world without the fears and cares of the real world, and for those hours, time dissipated into peace with the momentary beauty of a rainbow at the end of a sudden, violent storm. They did not know how long it was that they were lost to the world of dreams, nor did they know what it was that had happened to them in that time. They only knew, as they stirred into gentle wakefulness, that they were no longer at the edge of the Silver River. They knew as well that the time was new and somehow different. The feeling was exciting, but very secure. As his vision slowly returned, Shay was aware that there were people all around them, watching and waiting. He raised himself slowly up on one elbow, his hazy vision disclosing groups of small figures standing about, bending over in an anxious manner. From out of the vague background emerged a tall, commanding figure in loose-fitting clothes, leaning down at him, a broad hand on his slim shoulder. "Flick?" he asked apprehensively, rubbing his sleep-filled eyes with one hand as he squinted to make out the features of the shrouded figure. "You're safe now, Shay." The deep voice seemed to roll out of the shadowy figure. "This is the Anar." Shay blinked quickly, struggling to rise as the broad hand held him gently down. His eyes began to clear, and he saw in a glimpse the half-risen figure of his brother next to him, just waking from his deep slumber. Around them were squat, heavy-set figures of men Shay instantly knew to be dwarves. Shay's eyes caught the strong face of the figure at his side, and at that moment they came to rest on its gleaming chain mail, encasing the hand and forearm, stretching out to grasp his shoulder lightly. He knew the journey to the Anar had ended. They had found Callhaven in Balinor. Menion Leah had not found the last leg of the journey to the Anar quite so simple. When he first realized he had become separated from the two Velmen, panic set in. He was not afraid for himself, but he feared the very worst for the Omsfords if left alone to find their way out of the mist-shrouded Black Oaks. He too had called hopelessly, futilely, stumbling blindly about in the blackness until his voice was cracked. But in the end, he was forced to admit to himself that the search was useless under such conditions. Exhausted, he pushed on through the woods in what he believed to be the general direction of the lowlands, consoling himself slightly with the promise that he would find the others in the daylight. He was in the forest a longer time than he had anticipated, breaking free near dawn and collapsing on the edge of the grasslands. Though he did not know it then, he had emerged at a point south of the sleeping brothers. By this time, his endurance had been pushed to the limit, and sleep came over him so quickly that he could not remember anything after the slow, feather-light feeling of falling as he collapsed in the tall lowland grass. It seemed to him that he slept a very long time, but in fact he awakened only several hours after Shay and Flick had begun their journey towards the Silver River. Believing that he was a considerable distance south of the point the group had been making for while in the Black Oaks, Menion quickly chose to travel north and try to cut across the trail of his companions before reaching the river. If he failed to find them by that time, he knew that he would be confronted with the unpleasant possibility that they were still lost in the entanglement of the woods. Hurriedly, the Highlander strapped on his light pack, shouldered the great ash bow of the sword of Leah, and began to march rapidly northward. The few hours of afternoon daylight remaining disappeared quickly as he walked, his sharp eyes searching carefully for any sign of human passage. It was almost dusk when he finally picked up the signs of someone traveling in the direction of the Silver River. He found the trail to be several hours old, and he could reasonably be certain that there were more than one person. But there was no way to tell who the travelers were. So Menion pushed on hurriedly in the half-light of dusk, hoping to catch them when they stopped for the night. He knew that the skull-bearers would also be searching for them, but brushed his fears aside, remembering that there was no reason to connect him with the Veilmen. In any event, it was a calculated risk that he had to take if he expected to be of any service to his friends. Shortly thereafter, just before the sun dropped behind the horizon completely, Menion caught sight of a figure to the east of him, traveling in the opposite direction. Menion quickly called out to the other, who who seemed startled by the Highlander's sudden appearance and tried to move away from him. Menyon quickly took up the chase, running after the frightened traveler and calling to him that he meant no harm. After several minutes, he caught the man, who turned out to be a peddler selling cooking ware to outlying villages and families in these lowlands. The peddler, a bent, timid individual who had been frightened badly by the unexpected pursuit, was now thoroughly terrified by the sight of the tall, sword-bearing Highlander facing him at nightfall in the middle of nowhere. Menyon hastily explained that he meant no harm, but he was looking for two friends from whom he had been separated while traveling through the Black Oaks. This proved to be the worst thing that he could have told the little man, who was now thoroughly convinced the stranger was insane. Menyon considered telling him that he was the Prince of Leah, but quickly discarded that idea. In the end, the peddler revealed to him that he had seen two travelers fitting the general description. Oh my God! Ah. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. In the end, the peddler revealed to him that he had seen two travelers fitting the general description of the Valeman from a distance earlier in the afternoon. Ow! Menyon could not tell if the man had told him that much for fear of his life or to humor him. But he accepted the tale and bade good evening to the little man, who was obviously delighted to be let off so easily, and made a hasty escape southward into the sheltering darkness of the evening. Menyon was forced to admit to himself that it was now too dark to attempt to follow the trail of his friends, so he cast about for a likely campsite. He found a pair of large pines that appeared to be the best shelter available, and he moved into them, glancing anxiously at the clear night. There was sufficient light to enable a prowling northern creature to find any camp travelers with relative ease, and he inwardly prayed that his friends had sense enough to pick a carefully hidden spot to spend the night. He tossed down his own pack and weapons beneath one of the spreading pines and crawled under the shelter of its low-hanging branches. Famished from the past 2 days' journey, he devoured the last of his supplies, thinking as he did so that the Valeman would be faced with the same food shortage in the days ahead. Grumbling aloud at the bad luck that had separated them, he reluctantly wrapped himself in his light blanket and was quickly asleep, the great sword of Leah unsheathed at his side, gleaming dully in the moonlight. Unaware of the events that had transpired that night while he slept soundly several miles south of the Silver River, Menyon Leah rose the next day with a new plan in mind. If he could cut across country traveling northeast, he could catch up with the Valeman much more easily. He was certain that they would be following the edge of the Silver River as it wound its way eastward into the Anar forests, so their paths had to cross further upriver. Abandoning the faint traces of the trail left the previous day, Menyon began to journey across the lowlands in an easterly direction, thinking to himself that if he did not come across some sign of them upriver when he reached the water's edge, he would double back downstream. He also entertained hopes of sighting some small game that would provide meat for the evening meal. He whistled and sang to himself as he walked, his lean face relaxed and cheerful at the prospect of a reunion with his lost comrades. He could even picture the stolid disbelief on old Flick's stern face at the sight of his return. He walked easily with long, loping strides that covered the ground quickly and evenly, the swing, measured step of the experienced woodsman and hunter. As he traveled, his thoughts drifted back to the events of the past several days, and he pondered the significance of all that had transpired. He knew little about the history of the Great Wars and the reign of the Druid Council, the mysterious appearances of the so-called Warlock Lord, and his defeat by the combined mights of three nations. Most disturbing of all was his almost total lack of knowledge of the legend behind the Sword of Shannara, the fabled weapon that for so many years had been a watchword symbolic of freedom through courage. Now it was the birthright of an unknown orphan, half man, half elf. The thought was so preposterous that he still found it impossible to conceive of Shay in that role. He knew instinctively that something was missing from the picture. Something so basic to the whole puzzle of the great sword that without knowing what it was, the three friends were so many wind-blown leaves. Menyon also knew that he was not part of this adventure for the sake of friendship alone. Flick had been right about that. Even now, he was unsure exactly why he had been persuaded to undertake the journey. He knew he was less than a Prince of Leah should be. He knew that his interest in people had not been deep enough. He had never tried to understand the important problems of governing justly in a society where the monarch's word was the only law. Yet he felt that in his own way, he was as good as any man alive. Shay believed he was a man to be looked up to. Perhaps so, he thought idly, but his life to date appeared to consist of one long line of harrowing experiences and wild escapades that had served little or no constructive purpose. The smooth, grass-covered lowlands changed to rough, barren ground, rising abruptly in small hills and dropping sharply into steep, trench-like valleys that made travel slow and almost hazardous in places. Menyon looked anxiously ahead for some indication of more level terrain, but it was impossible to see very far, even from the top of steep rises. He plodded on, deliberately and steadily ignoring the roughness of the ground and silently berated his decision to come that way. His mind wandered briefly, then suddenly snapped back as he caught the sound of a human voice. He listened intently for several seconds, but could hear nothing further and dismissed it as the wind or his imagination. A moment later, he heard it again, only this time it was the clear sound of a woman's voice, singing softly somewhere ahead of him, faint and low. He walked more quickly, wondering if his ears were playing tricks on him, but all the time hearing the woman's mellow voice grow louder. Soon the mesmeric sound of her singing filled the air in a gay, almost wild abandon that reached into the innermost depths of the Highlander's mind, bidding him to follow, to be as free as the song itself. Almost in a trance, he walked steadily on, smiling broadly at the images the happy song conjured up to him. Vaguely, he wondered what a woman would be doing in these bleak lowlands, miles from any kind of civilization. But the song seemed to dispel all his doubts in its warm assurance that it came from the heart. At the peak of a particularly bleak rise, somewhat higher than the surrounding hillocks, Menion found her sitting beneath a small, twisted tree with long, gnarled branches that reminded him of willow roots. She was a young girl, very beautiful, and obviously very much at home in these lands, as she sang brightly, seemingly oblivious to anyone who might be attracted by the sound of her voice. He did not conceal his approach, but moved straight to her side, smiling gently at her freshness and youth. She smiled back at him, but made no effort to rise nor greet him, continuing the gay strains of the tune she had been singing all this time. The Prince of Leah came to a halt several feet away from her, but she quickly beckoned him to come closer and sit next to her beneath the odd-shaped tree. It was then that from somewhere deep within him a small warning nerve twinged. Some sixth sense, not yet entranced by her vibrant song, tugged at him and demanded to know why this young girl should ask a complete stranger to sit with her. There was no reason for his hesitation, other than perhaps the innate distrust of the hunter has for all things out of place and time in nature. But whatever the reason, it caused the Highlander to pause. In that instant, the girl and the song disappeared into vapor, leaving Menion to face the strange-looking tree on the barren rise. For 1 second, Menion hesitated, unable to believe what had just occurred, and then hastily moved to withdraw. But the loose ground about his feet opened even as he paused, releasing a heavy cluster of thick, gnarled roots which wound themselves tightly about the young man's ankles, holding him fast. Menion stumbled over backward, trying to break free. For a moment, he found his predicament to be ludicrous, but try as he might, he could not work free of those clinging roots. The strangeness of the situation increased almost immediately as he glanced up to see this strange root-limbed tree, previously immobile, approaching in a slow, stretching motion, its limbs extended towards him, their tips containing small but deadly-looking needles. Thoroughly aroused now, Menion dropped his pack and bow in one motion and unsheathed the great sword, realizing that the girl and the song had been an illusion to draw him within reach of this ominous tree. He cut briefly at the roots which bound him, severing them in places, but the work was slow because they were wound so tightly about his ankles that he could not risk broad strokes. Sudden panic set in as he realized he would not get free in time, but he faced the feeling down and shouted his defiance at the plant, which by now was almost on top of him. Swinging in fury as it came within reach, he quickly severed a number of the clutching limbs, and it withdrew slightly, its whole frame shuddering in pain. Menion knew that with its next approach, he had to strike its nerve center if he expected to destroy it. But the strange tree had other ideas. Coiling its limbs into itself, it thrust them towards the imprisoned traveler one at a time, showering him with the tiny needles that flew off the ends. Many of them missed altogether, and some bounced harmlessly off his heavy tunic and boots. But others struck the exposed skin of his hands and head and embedded themselves with small, stinging sensations. Menion tried to brush them off while protecting himself from further assault, but the little needles broke off, leaving their tips embedded in his skin. He felt kind of a slow drowsiness begin to steal over him, and portions of his nervous system began to go numb. He realized at once that the needles contained some sort of drug that was designed for easy disposition. Wildly, he fought the feeling seeping through his system, but soon dropped helplessly to his knees, unable to fight it, knowing the tree had won. But amazingly, the deadly tree appeared to hesitate, then to inch slightly backward, coiling again in attack. Slow, heavy footsteps sounded behind the fallen prince, approaching cautiously. He could not turn his head to see who it was, and a deep bass voice warned him abruptly to remain motionless. The tree coiled expectantly to strike, but an instant before it released its deadly needles, it was struck with the shattering impact by a huge mace that flew over the shoulder of the fallen Menion. The strange tree was completely toppled by the blow. Obviously injured, it struggled to rise itself and fight back. Behind him, Menion heard the sharp release of a bowstring, and a long black arrow embedded itself deep within the plant's thick trunk. Immediately, the roots about his feet released their grip and sank into the earth, and the main portion of the tree shuddered violently, limbs thrashing the air and showering needles in all directions. A moment later, it drooped slowly to the earth. With a final spasm, it lay motionless. Still heavily drugged from the needles, Menion felt the strong hands of his rescuer grip his shoulders roughly and force him into a prone position, while a broad hunting knife severed the few remaining strands binding his feet. The figure before him was a powerfully built dwarf, dressed in the green and brown woodman's clothing worn by most of the race. He was tall for a dwarf, a little over 5 feet, and carried a small arsenal of weapons bound about his broad waist. He looked down at the drugged Menion and shook his head dubiously. "You must be a stranger to do a dumb thing like that," he reprimanded the other with his deep bass voice. "Nobody with any sense of play is around with these sirens." "I'm from Leah, to the west," Menion managed to gasp out, his voice thick and strange to his own ears. "A Highlander. I might have known." The dwarf laughed heartily to himself. "You'd have to be, I suppose. Well, don't worry. You'll be fine in a few days. That drug won't kill you if we get it treated, but you'll be out for a while." He laughed again, turned to retrieve his mace. Menion, with his final ounce of strength, grasped him by the tunic. "I must reach the Anar. Colhaven," he gasped sharply. "Take me to Balinar." The dwarf looked back at him sharply, but Menion had lapsed into unconsciousness. Muttering to himself, the dwarf picked up his own weapons and those of the fallen Highlander. Then, with surprising strength, he heaved the limp form of Menion over his shoulders, testing the load for balance. Satisfied, at least that all was in place, he began trudging steadily, muttering all the while, moving towards the forests of the Anar. And that, my dear friends, was the end of chapter 7. Whew. So, as I'm sure you noticed, I changed the camera angle a little bit, about a little over 30 minutes in, mainly because my hip was starting to hurt the way I was sitting, so I had to adjust. So I'd taken off my reading glasses while I was fooling around, because I just put something else on, so I wasn't just listening to a fireplace while reading. But when I went to go put my reading glasses back on, they broke. And not in a way that I can easily fix them, because it was actually this piece that broke, not the piece in between. So I could glue them. Yeah, no. I mean, for $1.50, you can't really expect much. But, yeah, too bad. I like these ones. They were kind of pretty. I can only find the purples now in like a 3.0, and I wear 2.0. I'll just keep looking. I'll just pop in, take a look at what they got on the thing. You can even go to another dollar store and look there too, because there's one just up the street as well, and They've got a whole set there too. If I'm going to have to wear reading glasses, I might as well like what I have on. Because I am not so much of a fan of these ugly ones that I found. But they do the job too. I was thinking I might have to switch to these, but these ones held out long enough that I could at least get everything red. But now they're going to find their way into the recycle bin. C'est la vie. So, I have noticed while doing my editing on some of these chapters, I am mispronouncing words that should just be second nature, and it's not on purpose. I think I just read them wrong and just keep on going. So I'm purposely trying to catch myself while I'm doing that. And every once in a while, I will come across a word that I think I can't pronounce, or I know, but I just can't pronounce it. So I've got up on my screen, I've got my laptop here. I have the dictionary up, and I look up the word and see how it's pronounced, and I'll either go, oh, okay, I was saying that right. Or other times going, what the hell was I trying to say? Yeah. And of course, Miss Skitter decided she was going to sound off several times. As she got really, really loud, she was like right here, right by the mic. She was like right here. So I paused, I picked her up, cuddled her into my arm, thought I had her, thought she was doing good. A few seconds later, she was up and gone again. It's just the way she is. And then she sounded off again. She likes to sing for us. She thinks it's fun. I don't always think it's that, but hey, that's just the way she is. So, yeah, that's it. Not a whole lot exciting going on. I have worked... Well, I got back to work this week. I did 3 shifts. I was supposed to work today, but my good leg is just one massive cramp. Has been for 2 days. I can't even stand up to get into a shower. Like, I can't stand up long enough to take a shower without help. Joy. But that's a part of life. I think I'm going to take a quick break, have a little water, watch something silly on YouTube, maybe do a couple of games of solitaire, just because it's almost midnight and it'll be time for my new daily plays. And then we'll either do the chapter 8 of Sword of Shannara or chapter 3 of Dragon Drums, probably Sword of Shannara, because I am good up until the 9th of February for releases on Dragon Drums. Whereas this one, I've got 4 days. 4 days or 6 days? 6 days, sorry. I also want to get more of this read and maybe release it a little faster than every 4 days. Because otherwise this is never going to get done. But of course it all depends on how much I feel like reading. I haven't read all week because I've been so exhausted from being back to work. Well, we'll leave it at that. I will see you guys again shortly. I hope you have a great morning, afternoon, evening, whatever it is there for you. If you feel like it, please give me a like, subscribe, and comment. But if you don't, just realize that I appreciate the fact that you are here, and I look forward to seeing you back again. Have a great one. Bye-bye.